Picture this. A man walks onto the deck of his ship. He has a beard made entirely of writhing octopus tentacles. One of his hands is a crab claw. His ship is crewed by half-rotted sailors who have slowly merged with sea creatures over centuries of damnation. Tragic romance with a sea goddess. He stored his heart in a chest, which is technically where most people keep theirs, so points for anatomical awareness, and he controls a creature the size of a small island that can drag entire ships underwater. That is the Davy Jones most people picture, the one from Pirates of the Caribbean. The concept of Davy Jones in the hit movie series Pirates of the Caribbean was combined with the legend of the Flying Dutchman, with Jones portrayed as a captain assigned to ferry the souls of those drowned at sea to the afterlife, a duty he corrupted out of anger at his betrayal by the sea goddess Calypso. But here is the question that should have been nagging at you since the first time you watched those movies. Was he actually a real person? Not in the way you were imagining. Nobody can fully agree on where he came from, what he looked like, or even whether he had a body at all. Was Davy Jones a real pirate? Like an actual documented historical figure who sailed ships and did pirate things and ended up with his name attached to the ocean floor for eternity? During the 1630s, there was a pirate captain by the name of David Jones who sailed the Indian Ocean, but many scholars are in agreement that he was not sufficiently famous to gain such a lasting remembrance. So yes, a pirate named David Jones may have existed. That sounds promising, right? Finding a David Jones in Britain is a little like finding a John Smith. David was one of the most common first names in the English-speaking world. Jones was one of the most common Welsh surnames. The name Davy Jones suggests a Welsh connection, referring to Saint David, the patron saint of Wales. Proposed origins include a connection to the biblical Jonah, a tavern owner who press-ganged sailors. The historical record does not give us one man. What it gives us instead is something far more interesting. He was not a pirate captain in the traditional sense. He was not a historical figure with a biography. He was something sailors invented to explain the worst thing that could happen to them. Think about what life at sea actually looked like during the age of sail. You are on a wooden ship. You are surrounded by an ocean that does not care whether you live or die. Storms appear without warning. Ships vanish without a trace. Men fall overboard in the dark and are never seen again. The legend of Davy Jones embodies the fearsome and unpredictable nature of the sea, a reflection of the psychological coping mechanisms sailors developed during the perilous age of sail. Through storytelling, Davy Jones became a personification of the ocean's dangers, serving as both a cautionary tale and a means of enforcing discipline among seafarers. He was basically the ocean's human resources department, except every employee was dead. According to the mythology of sailors, Davy Jones is the fiend that presides over all the evil spirits of the deep and is often seen in various shapes, perching among the rigging on the eve of hurricanes, warning sailors of death and woe. He was not a captain you could fight or negotiate with. He was a force, a presence. Davy Jones was less captain of a ship and more regional manager of drowning. In folklore, Davy Jones is classified as a sea devil, distinct from classical deities of the sea like Poseidon or Neptune, separate from the pantheons of ancient mythology. He was maritime folklore's version of the Grim Reaper. Now, when did this legend actually show up in writing? Because one of the most interesting things about Davy Jones is that by the time anyone bothered to write him down, he was already old news. The earliest known printed reference to Davy Jones occurs in the 4 Years' Voyages of Captain, published in 1726 in London. The reference takes the form of a threat warning members of the ship's crew that if they are disobedient, they will be tossed into Davy Jones's locker. The first known written appearance is essentially someone threatening to throw another person overboard. But here is the key thing about that 1726 reference. The author does not explain what Davy Jones's locker is. He just uses it in the middle of a sentence and moves on. By the mid-18th century, the phrase was in common enough use that Tobias Smollett could use it without explanation in The Adventures of Peregrine Pickle in 1751, suggesting the term was already well established in English-speaking maritime culture. The problem is that nobody bothered to record where the name came from. He arrived in the written record fully formed, with no birth certificate, no origin story, and no forwarding address. Now let's talk about the locker itself, because this is where a lot of people get confused, especially if their main reference point is the movies. The locker in Davy Jones's Locker was not a magical prison. It was not a supernatural dimension you needed a magic compass to navigate. The word locker on board a ship generally means the place where any particular thing is retained or kept. So the sea became Davy Jones's storage place. Anything that sank was figuratively stored inside it. Maritime superstition discouraged direct discussion of death during voyages, so spin-off expressions included "in Davy Jones's grip" for someone near death, "awaken Davy Jones" for stirring up a storm, and "see you to Davy Jones" as a threat to kill. So we know what the locker was. But what about Davy Jones himself? What did the original version actually look like? Here's where it gets genuinely strange, and this is the part I promised you at the beginning of the video. There was no consistent appearance for Davy Jones, but Smollett's 1751 description is the best we have got, and it is something. In the Adventures of Peregrine Pickle, Davy Jones is described as the fiend that presides over all the evil spirits of the deep. In the story, Jones is described as having saucer eyes, 3 rows of teeth, horns, a tail, and blue smoke coming from his nostrils. The original Davy Jones looked less like an octopus and more like every medieval fear thrown into one body. He was whatever the sea needed him to be. That flexibility, the fact that he had no locked-in appearance, no single backstory, no definitive origin, is actually what allowed the legend to survive for centuries. Every generation could reshape him. Historians have been arguing about this for centuries, and nobody has landed a definitive answer. What we have is a collection of theories, some more plausible than others, and a few that are mostly just entertaining. The most linguistically respected theory involves 2 names you already know, David and Jonah. Linguists consider it most plausible that Davy was inspired by St. David of Wales, whose name was often invoked by Welsh sailors, and Jones by the biblical Jonah. In that story, the prophet Jonah disobeys God and attempts a sea voyage. God sends a storm, and the sailors, who determine that Jonah is to blame, cast him overboard, and the storm suddenly abates. Jonah was sailor slang for a person who brought bad luck on board a ship. So Jones, as a corruption of Jonah, is not a stretch. And Davy, from St. David, patron saint of Wales, a nation that produced enormous numbers of sailors, is similarly plausible. Put them together and you get Davy Jones, the Welsh devil of the sea, built from 2 names that every British sailor would have known. Then there is the Duppy theory. The 1870 and 1895 editions of the Dictionary of Phrase and Fable connected Davy to the West Indian Duppy, or Duffy, meaning a ghost or spirit, and Jones to the biblical Jonah. The full interpretation was that "he's gone to Davy Jones's locker" meant he has gone to the place of safekeeping where Duffy Jonah was sent. It is a colorful theory that captures the multicultural reality of colonial-era sailing routes, but the reference to Duppy or Duffy was deleted in later revisions of Brewer's dictionary. So treat that one as interesting, not settled. One explanation involves Jonah, another involves whales, and another involves a bartender kidnapping his customers. A British pub owner supposedly threw drunken sailors into his ale locker and then handed them over to be drafted onto any ship in need of crew. The tavern theory gives new meaning to getting carried away after a few drinks. An old sailor song from 1594 called "Jones's Ale is New" reportedly features a bartender named David Jones who drugged his patrons and sold them as slaves to passing ships, which, if true, would at least explain the locker part of the expression. But the evidence for this being the origin of the legend is weak. Now, over the centuries, Davy Jones did not stay in one place. He traveled through books, ballads, theater, naval rituals, and eventually film. Important mentions appeared in the works of Washington Irving, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville in Moby Dick, Charles Dickens in Bleak House, and most famously in Robert Louis Stevenson's 1883 novel Treasure Island. Each writer took the figure and pushed it in a slightly different direction. Fictional treatments, most prominently the Pirates of the Caribbean series, transformed Davy Jones from an abstract concept into a specific character. And that transformation involves some significant creative additions. So let's go back to the beginning. You open this video knowing one version of Davy Jones, the tentacled captain, the collector of souls, the man with the crab claw and the buried heart. And the question was any of that real? Davy Jones was probably never a real pirate. He was simply the name sailors gave to the darkness waiting beneath them. He was every sailor who went overboard in a storm and never came back. Every ship that vanished without explanation. Every story that the ocean swallowed and refused to return. He was not one man lost at sea. He was all of them,